Hey everyone. So today we are here with Associate Professor of Management at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, Tyler Wry, and he's also involved in the social impact initiative they have at the Wharton School. So just to start off, thank you for coming. Thank you for agreeing to have this with me. And then could you just please give like a brief introduction into your background, your education, and what exactly you do at the Wharton School?
Yeah, sure. Well, first off, thanks for having me. It's my pleasure to be here chatting with you. Um, Depending on how far back you want to get into my background, I could take up the whole half hour here, but I think I'll keep it a little bit shorter. So my background is that for a long time I wanted to be an entrepreneur, and I had a number of different startups. None of them were particularly successful, but ended up, sort of having a few bad experiences along the way with co-founders who were, almost sociopathic, like really just out for themselves, out for money. They'd step on your throat if they thought it would get them ahead. And so they'd hide behind, this idea that it's not personal, it's just business. And this just, it rung so hollow and so false with me that I really, lost my taste for just, profit maximizing entrepreneurship. And so after that, I really developed an interest in social enterprise. I had a great mentor who's now passed away, unfortunately, named Gary McPherson, back when I was still living in Canada, who was the executive director for the Canadian Centre for Social Entrepreneurship. And he taught me a ton about social enterprise and how to use business as a force for good in the world, particularly ventures and new business. And so, based on that, I went and got some more education, ended up doing a PhD where I studied social enterprise, corporate social responsibility, and really how ventures and corporations can act in the public good at the same time they, sustain themselves financially. And then after, publishing my dissertation and going on the job market, I got hired by Wharton School, where I now just got tenure last year, and I'm an associate professor of management and entrepreneurship. And I study social enterprise, social venture creation, as well as impact investing.
Yeah, congratulations. It's so amazing. One thing I saw while looking through the Wharton Social Impact Initiative page is that it was actually in your like bio or quote section, and you stated how social enterprises are they're inherently like counterintuitive, and realistically they shouldn't work because their goals really don't align of profit and a social change, but they really do. So could you explain that in more detail and explain why they do work?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one that scholars like me are still puzzling over a little bit. So the quote comes from this insight that people tend to still be siloed in how they're trained and how they think about the role of organizations in the world. So for a long time we had corporations, and the mission of corporations was profit maximization, generate wealth, return capital to shareholders, and that's their purpose, right? The Milton Friedman version of corporate capitalism. And on the other side, you had charity, philanthropy, and the nonprofit sector, and they specialized in creating social or environmental good. And then you had government as regulators and sort of, setting grand vision, for society. These boundaries are broken down now, right? So you have, nonprofits who act in enterprising ways, and you have for-profit companies that are trying to adopt social missions. And where it becomes tricky is oftentimes a company will face issues or decision points where it's unclear what the right decision is for how you would balance social impact with financial returns. And often it's that, in order to generate returns, you need to sacrifice social impact goals, right? So think about like a microfinance organization. These, organizations started off in the developing world, giving small loans to poor people to help them break cycles of poverty. So if you're a microfinance organization, you have a decision to make oftentimes around, do you support the poorest of the poor? Do you have fidelity to the strongest form of the social mission? Or do you move up market, charge higher interest rates, offer bigger loans, and try and sustain the financial base of the company? And so this balance is really precarious in a lot of instances, and it sort of makes these organizations unstable, where the founder or however governance setup is set up there needs to be thought about, how you balance these things over time, or the core of the organization gets unstable and the whole thing can just fall apart.
Yeah.
Now,
But you need that stable foundation of revenue so you could actually make an impact and your social change can be successful.
yeah, that's right. And so it becomes this interesting balancing act. And I've written some papers that think about, some of the strategies that people have as they're thinking about this stuff goes from, simple thinking to more complex thinking. And so simple thinking would be just straight up trade-off reasoning, right? If I
Mhm.
want more of this, I have to accept less of that. Whereas more complex forms of reasoning might take into account time. So, work on this piece first so that the other piece can work later. It could be some sort of a novel synthesis where you put these things together in a way that no one's thought of, and that's what makes them fit. Or you do something else that no one's thought of, but it's the product of this ongoing, deep, and effortful processing.
Yeah. So next I wanted to ask, so a lot of social enterprises today and just firms in general today, they're facing a lot of societal pressure to take on social and environmental problems, even though like traditionally these responsibilities really fell to, like you said, government and other philanthropic organizations. So do you think that social enterprises and businesses are really the best way to take on these problems?
No, not at all. So that said, I think social enterprises and businesses that are socially responsible, I mean, these are fundamentally good things, right? It's better than companies not being responsible or entrepreneurs not trying to start, ventures that solve social problems.
Mhm.
But if business is the lead actor, there's no coordination, right? And there's not necessarily any continuity, right? Because they're subject to all sorts of different pressures, and if these get ratcheted up on one side or another, you know, these organizations, I mean, they have to sustain themselves, right? And they're going to go with whatever way the wind is blowing to a certain extent. You can't expect them to act in straight up altruistic ways. It's not what they're designed to do,
Mhm.
right? Like you need government, you need a strong policy framework, you need to have this overall grand articulated vision that then business and social enterprise is a part of.
Okay.
Because if you don't, I mean, think about like a symphony, right? Like
Mhm.
if you have everyone playing their own instrument in an uncoordinated way, each person might be playing a really nice song on their own. When you put it all together, I mean, there's no guarantee it sounds good, right? It's probably going to be like a cacophony. You need the conductor, right? Like
Mhm.
someone who's standing there with a baton and orienting the actors in a way that all sort of works together.
Yeah. That metaphor really put it into place. Like they play a part in a bigger problem, in a bigger
Totally.
whole. Mhm. So, like you said right now, social enterprises, they've grown in popularity over the past few years. Where do you think this is coming from? Like, what do you think the cause of businesses taking on more than just a for-profit goal is?
So I think there's two forces. One is consumers are exerting pressure on existing companies to step into the breach and have a position on social issues and to do things that are pro-social.
Mhm.
So there's that consumer pressure, and the other one, I mean, which I see every day, being a professor at Wharton, especially a professor of entrepreneurship, is I think that this next generation of talented business people. I mean, and just this next generation overall, they don't want to silo their life, right? They don't want to go and work for a polluting company by day and then go volunteer by night, right? They want to you know have some more authenticity and integrity across the different spheres of their lives.
Mhm.
So, they'd much rather, if they're going to start a venture, have a social impact piece that they feel good about, as opposed to try and make, $10 billion and then, engage in philanthropy, 50 years from now, which I mean was the model for a long time, right? So I think there's this, this desire to have the alignment and, more fidelity with your values and your morals in your day-to-day life.
Yeah. And I've actually been doing some research into this myself about Generation Z. And like statistically, they're much more, like you say, you could say progressive than past generations. They care much more about these problems, especially through the last year. I feel like COVID, the Black Lives Matter movement, the presidential election really like almost like catalyzed this and made that more like amplified how much they care about that and how vocal they are.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think, that these trends have been a long, long time coming. They've been a long time, but a longer time. So I think you see the manifest around these inflection points, right? Where there's, some hot stimulus that people are reacting to. But, even if you look over the last 5 years, so I did this survey of all entrepreneurial ventures that participated in the incubator program at Wharton called the Venture Implementation Program. And out of all of the ventures in the last 5 years, 72% of the founders said that they had defined social impact goals with their ventures, right? And this is across every venture. I wasn't just looking for social enterprises. I just wanted to know what was motivating these entrepreneurs.
Mhm.
And so, a huge majority of them are motivated by social impact goals. And then I asked them, how important is social impact versus financial maximization? And social impact rated out slightly higher on average than maximizing profits, right? And so that's over 5 years, and it was pretty stable across the years. So I think, circling back, this is something that's been a while coming.
Yeah. So it's obviously has been growing and will continue to grow. Do you think like in the coming years, maybe decade, there will be a point where companies really have to implement some type of social goal or some CSR initiative to be competitive and be successful? Like, do you think that that'll be a must in every business plan?
I'd like to say yes, but I don't know. As an academic, you're always thinking in counterfactuals, right? So yeah, I hope that these pressures keep ramping up. At the same time, there's front stage, backstage, right? There's visible acts versus stuff that goes on behind the scenes. And so, you could imagine a case where there's a company who, is signaling all sorts of virtue, but they're also doing all sorts of bad things, outside of public view, right? And you hope they get outed and their hypocrisy gets punished. But you know, I guess maybe I'm a little bit cynical. I think that fundamentally, companies are going to react to market pressures. So as long as there's pressures to do good, they will manifest these behaviors. But there's also fundamental pressures on the bottom line, right? So if they can do things that'll help their bottom line that they think they can get away with in the shadows, I think they'll do those things. And we're actually seeing some evidence that companies that do more in terms of CSR are more likely to be targeted by hedge fund activists, right? So the winds are blowing both ways a little bit. And yeah, I'd love to see companies all be wonderful and acting in very socially responsible ways. But I'm not optimistic that's going to happen in the
Yeah, I actually learned about that in one of my classes a few years ago, that most companies aren't playing strategic CSR, so they don't actually care about the goal. They're just doing it to maximize profits, to make themselves look good in the eyes of the consumer.
Well, yeah, and why wouldn't they? That's what corporations are set up to do, right? Like when companies do bad things, it's sort of like, when they do things to maximize profits and people get mad, it's sort of like, well, do you get mad at a cat for hunting mice, right? Like it's what it does, right? So it's all about the incentives you set up around that, or else you need to fundamentally change the nature of the corporation, which, it's another conversation, right? Like you could do that, but short of that, if all the incentives are set up one way, you have to just think about how to orient those incentives towards better goals, or else, like, why would you be surprised companies are doing,
Yeah,
irresponsible things? Corporations aren't altruistic. They can't be.
Yeah. So I want to go a little bit into impact investing. So I know you said you taught and studied that as well. So that's obviously grown in popularity like social entrepreneurship, but I know a lot of people aren't really familiar with exactly what it is. So could you just give us a little intro to what impact investing is and the potential effects that it could have?
Yeah, impact investing is any investment you make where you're trying to generate a social or environmental return alongside a financial return. And so it could be an investment into an organization, could be an investment into a fund, but something where you're trying to get your capital back with some sort of return that is around market rate. At the same time, the investment does some good for people or the planet. I think it's really potentially exciting because if you think back to what we were just talking about in terms of the incentive structures that companies have to do X versus Y, they have a real incentive to try and make themselves attractive to capital providers. And so to the extent that impact investing becomes more popular, and there's really good evidence that it is becoming more popular. And not only that, like the trend is crazy. I think I'm trying to remember what the figure is in billions invested right now in assets under management. It's significant, and it's growing at like a 13% CAGR, compound annual growth rate. And you have between 30 and 60 trillion dollars being passed down to millennials and women in the next like 30 years. It's called this great wealth transfer. And
Mhm.
millennials and women care more about social impact in their investing than, I mean, let's be honest, old white men, right? So, the potential is for impact investing to, do all sorts of really good things, but it's contingent on it being done in the right way.
Yeah. So like that, I know you just touched on this. Where do you see the market for impact investing in the coming years? Like, how do you think it's going to grow? Do you think it'll like take priority over other very popular jobs in the finance department
So are you asking about, will it become more popular as an investment product or as a career track?
as a career track?
Yeah. I mean, it's got a ways to go. I mean, the issue is less demand than there is supply, right? Or the issue is not a supply issue, right? Like, I think there's lots of people who want to get into impact investing. I actually know there are.
Mhm.
There's not that many jobs yet in impact investing,
Okay.
right? So, the trick right now is like there's a ton of energy with students. I mean, if you look at the MBA population at Wharton who are interested in getting into impact investing, but there's not a ton of jobs for them when they graduate. So, you know, I think that there's a ton of interest. I think it's growing, but the sector needs to, grow at the same rate as the interest is growing.
Yeah. So this one, like my final question. So just advice for people trying to get into social business, whether if it's through investing, entrepreneurship, or some other avenue. Like you said, it's kind of hard for a lot of jobs to be there right now because it is a growing market. How would you recommend that a student of high school, undergraduate, or graduate wants to get involved in social business goes about that?
I think the best way to do it is to learn as much as you can about it.
Mhm.
Right? There's all sorts of blogs, podcasts. There's no shortage of information if you're interested in this area, and just become acquainted with it. Right? Like understand how people are thinking about it, what the topics are, what the debates are, what the exciting companies are in the space. Who the exciting investors are, who did impact invest in, the different ways they invest. So, I mean, depending on your level of knowledge, I mean, you may want to get just some basic entrepreneurial or finance knowledge, right? Like, how does entrepreneurship work? How does entrepreneurial finance work? And then what is the social component? How does this, mix in? And, once you have that basis of learning and understanding, it's going to help you understand how to enact these things, right? Because the last thing you want to do is have good intentions, but try and act in the world in a way where we're putting the top brick in the wall first, right? Like you have to build up. And so it's like, okay, I'm going to start a social business, top brick in, it's going to fall all the way to the bottom, right? So do the legwork, be curious, learn, build that knowledge base, and it's going to put you in a great position when you actually have opportunities to do practical things.
Yeah, just build a foundation to go off of eventually.
Totally, 100%.
Great. So, like I said, that was the last question I had for you. So just thank you for coming again.